T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent as a way of talking about tradition in general, and how it, the role it plays, that topic, in 20th century lit theory, and 21st century lit theory for that matter. And it is connected to what we discussed last time about the canon. The canon is related to tradition, but tradition is the topic that T.S. Eliot writes on, and Eliot will frame it, the idea of the tradition, in a way which I think is very influential in the modernist movement of literature. I'll say more about that in a minute, but I don't, before we get to the 20th century movement and the embrace of tradition by the modernists, as really a backlash against the romantics, quite frankly, and what happens in the 19th century. Let's pull it back a bit outside of the context of the immediate context of our time and their time, for that matter, and push the whole discussion of tradition to a more traditional place, which is where it begins in the study of lit theory, literary criticism. And I think we can already see it in the works of Aristotle, the appeal to a tradition in the sense of an activity which is undergone by writers using common forms of reference and common techniques. Right? Aristotle's Poetics is recommending to us a certain type of literature as the greatest form, namely tragedy, but then he's identifying features of the tragedy, which he says that the best tragedians, so first of all, tragedians employ these types of conventions within their work, and the best sort is Oedipus the King, because it adds certain other features to it. And so I think Aristotle is a good place to begin a discussion of tradition, which is somewhat ironic because he's already talking about something that pre-exists his writing, and we take Aristotle as the beginning. But he's not the beginning. He's commenting, and to some degree he's commenting backwards, even although he doesn't go to discuss the epic. Really, the epic in Homeric form is the great tradition. It's the one that certainly that Plato refers to, or Socrates refers to, in talking about the influence of the poets and paideia and its threat to the republic, or the polis, the ideally conceived polis. He's talking about the great esteem accorded to the poets. And as I say, he means the epic poets. He means Homer there. While at the same time, it's very clear that he will cite Homer, that is Socrates, and cite him approvingly, and assume that others will also approve with him. So there's an established tradition within Greece of acknowledging the greatness of Homer, to the point where at which Homer is, I don't say proof texted, but he is used to illustrate a point one wants to make, and it's regarded as persuasive. The great Homer. So there is a tradition there that exists there already in the beginning, what is often seen as the beginning of the tradition, namely the works of Aristotle's Poetics, etc. And I said to you last semester when we talked further about this topic, that understanding of the tradition continues in the Roman period, and in between in the Hellenistic critics, where they start to come up with the terms of engagement for studying literature, and they come up with the idea of a canon, among other things, and genres, and there are a certain number of genres which will be acknowledged and will be recommended for students to study and read and delight in them, and by so doing you will become educated. So there's already a curriculum, as it were, that's been established in the Hellenistic period, which the Romans don't add to, in the sense that they don't add more genre of literature. And they still regard Homer and the Greeks as the greatest works of literature. And they themselves, when they want to do homage to Homer, will simply add on to Homer, like Virgil does in the Aeneid, clearly tipping his cap to Homer and his two epics. And really, you can even see that within Homer's works himself. The Iliad makes no reference to the Odyssey. There's no references there at all. And yet the Odyssey is frequently referring to events that took place in the Iliad. Now, in a sense, that's unsurprising, because the events that take place in the Iliad precede that of the Odyssey. Okay, so that's the case. But if it's a single author, and the Odyssey preceded the Iliad would have some sort of veiled references to what happens after the Iliad, and there's none. Absolutely none. And there shouldn't be, as I say. But so the Iliad is the foundation for the Odyssey, and in a sense it's referring to a single event of such momentous significance that everything thereafter is an outpouring out of that great event. And the tragedies often refer back to events related to the sack of Troy. So that single event, the sack of Troy, gives birth to the whole Hellenistic literary culture, which the Romans inherit and simply build upon. So that becomes the tradition. And that tradition can be seen in generic terms. So we can talk about the epic, or the tragedy, or the comedy, or the lyric poem. You can see it thematically. So the word tradition is used that way. You can see it as a combination of all sorts of features. The word tradition I'm referring to now can be used in multiple ways. More generally, and Eliot will talk about this, and the 20th century will build on this, tradition is the body of texts and interpretations current among a group of writers at a given time and place. That's the tradition. It's a body of texts. The Hellenistic period established that here are what the texts are, and also the interpretative practices that go with it. However, here's what to read, and here's how to read it. There's a traditional way of reading as well as a traditional body of writing, and that's important here, because in literary theories in the 20th century, we get ways of reading, even when they engage with the traditional texts, that are at odds with the traditional way of reading. So I think you need to have a traditional hermeneutics as well as a traditional poetics, and that's why last semester I talked about hermeneutics as well as poetics, although in general when you're in literary theory you really are focusing on the texts. But even your choice of the text is going to be caught up in the idea of how to read the text, because if you are already deciding that what a great text is going to fit with your hermeneutics, then you're probably going to exclude certain works from the canon of literature, and this is in fact what we saw at the end of last class. Contemporary scholars don't want to read Homer, they don't recommend Homer, nobody reads Homer. And you can start pulling that from Homer into the Roman period and even forward into the canonical texts of the English language, such as Shakespeare and Milton. Milton was killed off more or less as a common text for English lit students decades ago because of his Christianity, despite his influence on the Romantics, who they revere. And Shakespeare's now being assassinated in Western universities as well. Not because he's too Christian, but because he's white and male and patriarchal at whatever. I mean, there's a whole variety of reasons. But he is also, there's a new tradition arising of excluding Shakespeare from the canon of texts that must be read, and it's because of a hermeneutic posture that's taken towards literature to begin with. And it suggests that there's no intrinsic merit in the texts, and there's no such thing as intrinsic merit, and that's because, again, they're going to attack value in texts. Bloom, as we saw last time, attributed the value of literary texts to one thing and one thing only, namely aesthetics, which he does not particularly define quite frankly. He doesn't define what he means by that even. He has that sensibility. He says the texts are evidence of writers with similar sorts of sensibilities, but he doesn't really give a clear definition of what he means by that. And it does seem to be very much like Oscar Wilde's notion of art for art's sake. It's very much of an elite, aesthete sensibility, which he says that the tradition creates. And this is what the value of the tradition is, or a canon of texts is. This is not a traditional understanding. It's certainly not a traditional hermeneutic. Homer is read by the Greeks as a model for life. It reflects their view of everything. As I say, the Homeric text is encyclopedic. It's for all educational purposes. It's one of the conventions that arises around an epic, in fact, that it is encyclopedic. And it has this pedic there at the end. It's for paideia. It's for education of the young. Just like the word paideia is used in Ephesians 6, verse 4. The epic serves the same function, and so Homer is called the teacher of all Greece, all Hellas. So the idea of tradition goes way back to the text that we looked at last semester, and I don't want to immediately get caught up in the 20th century debates over what we mean by tradition without first having said that, because that would be assuming that the 20th century approaches, even the traditionalists are defending the tradition traditionally. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to assume that that's the case. We've looked at some of the defenses there already. And we will find that the traditional way of understanding any text is by placing it in the context of the tradition. Aristotle begins that for us to some degree. There's a hermeneutic self-consciousness about him in relation to tradition. He sees himself in continuity there. There's something normative about what Aristotle is saying. You could say that it's just descriptive. He's describing the tragedy that he sees on stage in Athens. I note that it has this, I note that it has that. But if he did, then what he says about the tragedy would be held to be true of his time, but would no longer be relevant to a very different time and place. But that's not what he intends. He sees there's something normative about the tragedy and its relation to human nature, and he appeals to human nature, actually. And later critics, when they cite Aristotle, cite him for precisely this reason. They think that there's something normative about Aristotle and universal, and is not simply a reflection of the conditions of the Greek polis of the 4th century. Right? They mean something more than that. And they think the reason we should appeal to Aristotle in his categories is because they still apply. And why? Because the genres are still powerful and human nature has not changed. So and this is why it's interesting that it's the philosopher that is the one who identifies this. There's a universality about poetry. Now, Plato's charge was that the poets were insufficiently universal. They were appealing to the passions, not to the ideas. Aristotle says, no, that's not true. They do apply to things that are enduring. And in fact, they are very much of the same sort of character as the subject matter that the poets deal with. The poets and the philosophers have a similar aim or end in sight. At least the best poets, and that's the only ones we're interested in here. There's obviously bad poetry that only appeals to the passions, and Plato could justly criticize those and banish them from the Republic. But Homer does not deserve that fate. And so I don't think it's an explicit critique of Plato, but it's certainly, he's disagreeing with his master here. And Aristotle's defense of the tradition is understood to be a good one. So what we learn to understand and evaluate a poem by placing it first in the context of the tradition, not in the context of history. Note, tradition is different than history. And the cultural critics that Bloom is pushing back against want to historicize it. And by historicizing it, relativize it. Note, that's the purpose of context, contextualization. The great practice that you learn from the historical critical method is to historicize. But when they historicize, the effect of this is to render it subject to time, yes, but also the time has passed. And so, but the first act is to historicize it. And this is called contextualization. But the effect of historicizing is actually to relativize. And by relativizing, they're saying that it is not universal anymore. There are no universally good genres, and there are no universally valid texts, and there is no universal human nature. And all three of those things are implicated in this. And that is what people have failed to understand happen in the discipline of English literature, is the assault on Homer or Milton was not only an assault on the texts, specific texts there, which are of great interest to some and of no moment to others, but human nature itself is being renegotiated in the process. We'll see that towards the tail end of this course. But that is implicated in all that, and I'll say more about that again a little bit later on when I come to talk about Northrop Frye in relation to this. But so tradition and evaluating a poem places it in the context not of history, which the historicist critics of all types do, but the Marxists in particular will do this, but the whole of the tradition. Or even tradition, so you could see the tradition of the epic or the tradition of the tragedy, so you could explore it generically as well. And that's the way I approach Intro to English literature here at Tyndale, as you know. I begin with Homer and then move on to the Aeneid and explore the tradition of the epic as a way of introduction to the tradition more broadly. It reduces it's a way of selecting the text. Because again, within the context of an introduction, I can't cover everything I would like. It's a way to get a unity there. So contextualization there is within tradition and not within history. Very, very important thing. So this contextualization may produce analyses that are structural. So you could look at the formal similarities and differences between the structure of Homer's epic and the structure of Virgil's epic. Remember, in terms of Virgil, he begins with the wanderings of Aeneas and he concludes with the battles of Aeneas. Part 6, or the first 6 books, are dealing with the wanderings of Aeneas that are a lot like the Odyssey. The second 6 are like the Iliad. And what lies right in between is his descent into the underworld. He goes down into the underworld like a Trojan. He arises like a Roman. He's a different man because of what he sees down there and what he hears down there. Because what he hears down there is of the divine nature of the Roman Empire to come. And of his offspring, at least by adoption, Caesar, Augustus, who is one of the descendants of Julius, his son Iulus, who's from Julius Caesar. Well, he's adopted by Octavian is adopted by Julius Caesar, and therefore he's in the line, and Aeneas is his ancestor. So this is a legitimization. So again, what does he do with the structure of the epic there? Well, he uses that and he takes 2 epics and he makes it into one, thereby suggesting that his one epic is greater than Homer's 2, and that he has 2 heroes. Homer has 1. Virgil has 1. So again, that contextualization is a structural comparison. You could also do it in terms of different sources and influences. Many different ways you can traditionally read a text. And I welcome all the traditional ways of reading the text. I think they are very fruitful. And then there's the non-traditional ways of reading the texts, namely historical, which I despise. And I think they're non-literary. And they're relativizing. And they are effectively dehumanizing. And that's what's at stake in the canon, not what Mr. Bloom says. Mr. Bloom makes a very poor case for tradition and for the canon of literature. Very poor indeed. Although some of his texts are traditional texts, and he is defending himself against his contemporary critics who are very hostile to that canon, but he doesn't defend it in a way that a traditional critic would defend it. He's not referring to its structure or its themes or its view of human nature. That's not there. He doesn't even want to appeal to morality either, which is how the tradition develops, by the way. So again, the epic becomes Christianized. Bloom does not want to talk about Milton's Christianity. He thinks that it is not the subject that should interest a critic at all. The Romantics, when they read Milton's Paradise Lost, they also wanted to void it of the Christian context. They wanted to read Satan as Milton's hero, even. Not that they actually thought that Milton's Satan was his hero, but that he was of the devil's party without knowing it, because he was a true poet. And true poets are not interested in morality, let alone theology. True poets are not interested in such things. So say the Romantics. So says Bloom, the Romantics scholar, right? He shares the Romantics' views on this. So there's great irony in a Romantic scholar, namely Harold Bloom, who is a Gnostic in his own views, being the defender of the tradition in the academy in the United States in the 80s and 90s. And as I say, I enjoy Bloom. I think he's interesting and he's fun, just like Eagleton's fun. I mean, he's witty and literary enough to make him interesting. But that doesn't mean that his arguments can hold water. I don't think they hold any water. It's leaking terribly. So, and even flagrantly anti-traditional writing, like avant-garde poetry or experimental writing, can only be understood in the context of the tradition. Because you say, so this is very innovative. Think, well, what do you mean by innovative? What do you mean new? You have to understand the old to understand that it's new. Everything's new if you're ignorant. First time you read anything, it's new. But if somebody's claiming to be avant-garde before things, then you have to say, well, this is the term of comparison. And again, you need the tradition to establish novelty. And even within the genres of, when Milton claims that he will pursue things yet unattempted in prose or rhyme, he knows what's been written before in prose and rhyme, and we can't assess whether Milton's claim is a good one unless we have a similar reading background. And if we're going to claim that Milton is superior to his predecessors, we have to be able to judge them according to the traditional means of assessing them, which are not historical. That one comes before the other, there's no doubt about that. And that does not justify its continual reading. We don't just read something because it's old. Otherwise, we could be reading the little wooden scrolls from Vindolanda in the north of England, where they discover them buried in the mud, and they break them apart and they find out what's shopping lists that have been preserved in the swampy water, and it's managed to preserve these. It's extraordinary. I had a friend who was worked in Vindolanda as an archaeologist there. Very interesting. Tells us something about the ancient world. They're writing, but they're not writing anything worth reading in terms of great literature, but they are writing that tells us something about the common life there. Very interesting. in a very restricted sense. So even if something is anti-traditional, we only understand its value as such when we have the tradition to see what it's writing against. But we don't even the language that we have inherited, the English language, contains relics of previous great writers. Shakespeare's phrases pass into the English language. The concepts, even concepts develop over time, and they develop in relation to truths that are held to be so true that we want to retain it in a concept. So I'm not against neologisms, like you find at the Oxford English Dictionary, but I am against neologisms that are put into a dictionary as if they're authoritative in the same year in which they're uttered. I think it's nonsense. At that point, the Oxford English Dictionary, which began on historic principles, is historicizing and relativizing the meaning of words, which was not its original intent. It wanted to find the sources of the words that we have, their etymology, their roots. What's the earliest use of this word, and where does it come from, and what's it leaning on? It could be a Greek concept or a Latin one. Often in English, they're that, or an Anglo-Saxon word that underlies that, and the original user would have had that word in mind here, and we should remember that, and that's part of the richness of it. That's Tolkien's understanding, who contributed to the Oxford English Dictionary, by the way. One of the entries, or some of the entries. So that notion of tradition is important here. And the fact that we can't really escape the tradition. That's going to be T.S. Eliot. I'm going to get to Eliot in a second here. But how the individual poem fits into the tradition, which is best understood in the context of a interplay of conformity or difference. Those that want to be traditionalists and conform utterly to what was written before are not worth reading. Those that have read what has come before them and are interacting with that tradition and differing from them even in small ways are adding something to the tradition. So I think the tradition can build up. So there is a sense of progress even within the tradition. There is a mountain that has been piled up, laid on the foundation, let's say, of Homer. Which is still a mountain, and it still does rise. And it can be, there's a dialogue, and you need to understand the dialogue, but there's also a sense of improvement here. At the very least, adaptation. And you see that in the difference between the one another, but you have to have read the text to begin with to begin that conversation. But that's a traditional way of reading the tradition. And we can see that the response can be very, very strong or weak. It can just be an echo. If it's strong, they'll even use the genre itself, like Milton's Paradise Lost is an epic, and does he want us to compare his epic to the foregoing epics? Oh my goodness, does he ever? I mean, he could not assert it more strongly. He follows all the conventions, and even in his introduction, his language, he's explicitly courting comparison. Mine is going to soar far above the Aeonian Mount, way above where the Greeks are. Well, this is a very arrogant thing to say. If it were only Milton saying it, he says that it's because I'm going to proclaim Christian truth, which eclipses the pagan world. Because it is true, it's universally true. It reflects human nature, not just the nature of heroism that we see in the Iliad in the figure of Achilles, as great as Achilles is, and he is great. Achilles' greatness is more like Satan's. Proud, indomitable, and great. Just Achilles is such a great character. Worthy of remembrance. But the Greek view of life is very bleak. Achilles in Homer's Odyssey is found in the underworld, and he is, and Odysseus speaks to him and praises him for his life. And Achilles, after he's had a drink of blood so that he can speak and not just be the shadowy essence of what he once was, says that he would rather have lived to a ripe old age than to have been down in this place. So he lived for fame. He died young. Everybody's singing his praises. And he says, but the outcome of this is tragic. So there's this bleakness about the Greek worldview that the Greeks were well aware of. Homer is speaking on his great hero Achilles. Here's what he's reduced to. Like, just think of that. He's praising Achilles in the one, and in the other, he's showing the vanity of the life that he lived. And yet he'd rather burnt bright and was snuffed out than be where he is. But from the vantage point of that side of things, what a terrible thing is death is, and the afterlife. It's a terrible thing. You don't want to live here. And that adds to the greatness of the heroes that are fighting for valor in the world. So that's the greatness. But Milton is announcing that death is not the end of life, and in fact is the way in which life begins in certain ways. So that's it. So he's totally revising the epic, using the epic to announce what epic greatness is, and that religious effect transforms the epic. It becomes a religious text for the West at that point, because Christianity is a universal religion. It's not polytheistic. It applies to all of humanity. Right? So that is a new tradition. Once that traditional note has been established by Milton, no one who writes after Milton can ignore Milton's engagement with the epic genre or with greatness in literature. You cannot ignore Milton. You can airbrush him out of the canon, but you just show yourself to be a benighted fool by doing that. You cannot do that. The Romantics don't do it. They're all engaging with Milton, writing their own epics, clearly in dialogue with him. They don't agree with Milton, but they can't ignore him. And so we can note all sorts of considerations. We can look at imitation, mimesis. We can consider issues like influence. We can consider originality. We can consider intertextuality. What Matthew Arnold calls touchstones, the great Victorian critic, the little short passage or even single lines from ancient texts that have been picked up by the later poet, and they expect us to recognize that that touchstone has been put in there, and are such a part of the great books as they will come to be defended. So that's a little bit background. How about T.S. Eliot and the term as it's used in the 20th century? Well, as I said, it is most strongly associated with this movement that we call modernism. This is a confusing thing for students of English literature. Whenever we use the word modern, it always refers to now, right? But modernism as a literary movement begins in the 20th century, and the 20th century is not particularly traditional. And modernism, even more confusingly, allies itself with traditionalism. So when you look at T.S. Eliot's own writing, he doesn't write in the traditional genres. He doesn't write an epic. Doesn't write it. Well, he does write plays, but not really a tragedy. It's not trying to fit that, but he is engaging with the tradition. There are allusions everywhere in Eliot. This is a traditional way he's engaging with the past, sometimes through lines, what Arnold calls touchstones. And it's a very modern way of engaging with the tradition. It's still traditional because it regards the tradition as the substance of who we are. We arise out of a tradition. And again, if you don't want to arise out of a tradition, then you can claim to be an amnesiac and act like you're an amnesiac because you don't want to remember, you want to forget. It's a purposive forgetfulness, which is an odd thing to do from the vantage point of a cultural elite, to encourage forgetfulness. It's like a man who looks in a mirror and then forgets what his face looks like. Where was that written? James, yeah. But that is much of the 20th century in terms of the criticism. But Eliot and company are in the modernist movement. Here we have W.B. Yeats, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot. These are the modernist poets. Make prominent mention of the tradition. And now they have in mind not just traditions, a tradition of the epic, a tradition of the tragedy, but the tradition. And they seem to see it as a great body of works, and in a sense like a canon. The tradition, referring to sometimes the whole of the literary past, but more often, and this is the distinctive of modernity or modern poetry, just single lines. I'm just going to throw a line in the wasteland that I will have plucked from a previous, maybe Dante. You'll even quote him in Italian. Just throw it in the middle of this and expect you to have understood the reference and be able to read it in Italian for that matter, which he's already then reducing his audience to the group of people in English who are able to read in that other language. Or you have to consult the footnotes or whatever. I mean, fine, but the effect is not quite the same, and it fosters a sort of elitism. So this is problematic for the modernist movement and for its approach to tradition. It's already pushing the English letters in the direction of elitism and in the direction of Bloom's sort of elitism, a Gnosticism, a secret knowledge. Well, it's not secret here. It's so highly educated that very few people are capable of following it. You first have to know Greek and Latin and Italian and German and French and whatever language the author will himself appeal to in that language. Now, I was schooled in that tradition, so I learned languages. But you have to realize that there's a very few people who are going to do that, or going to want to do it, or feel that that is the path of needed for education. It is education, but it's now so elite that I'm not sure that it's a non-traditional development of the tradition, because Homer is for all of Hellas. It's for everyone. Milton's Paradise Lost is intended for everyone. T.S. Eliot's approach to the tradition is read by some with great appreciation, but he is really catering to a very small minority of people who won't even bother. He's not trying to recapture the culture on a broad scale. And this is my critique. So the little snippets there, the touchstones, single lines of poetry, and even sometimes non-literary writing, which the poet regards as central to the culture and which his own work is designed to fit. So T.S. Eliot's modernism bears all the marks of anti-traditionalism, and he adapts his work to that. And some who are traditionalists like C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien do not like Eliot's type of writing. They're going to share his esteem for the tradition, but the way in which you've decided to utter yourself, we think this is a grave mistake. We are not going to write that type of writing. And just the form is problematic here. And so then Lewis and Tolkien will try and appeal to the form of writing that they like, with greater or lesser success. I think Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is a great success, and he is engaging with Beowulf and the great Anglo-Saxon poems, and trying to recapture something of that, and he succeeds largely without even knowledge of those things. Now, critics like Tom Shippey or others who have knowledge of Anglo-Saxon can bring to your attention the depth in the work that has escaped your notice, but you can read it without that and appreciate it, and the success of that is what made Tolkien the author of the century by the estimation of the British public in the late 20th century, 1999, when I was there. He was pronounced to be the author of the century. The Academy went crazy. They're so frustrated that this populist work should have that sort of appeal. But what's interesting about that is that although it was dismissed as, fantasy, kids' literature, what drew people to it is that it touched on the same subject matters of heroic greatness that the tradition did. So it was a return to a tradition at odds with the modernist movement. Now, most academics are enthralled with the modernist movement and think that that's the way to approach the tradition, but note that it's so highly elitist that the only people that end up being able to defend it are people like Harold Bloom, who don't even want to appeal to morality or to life. It is literally ivory tower stuff, that. But Eliot tries to engage with that, and so here's the work, Tradition and the Individual Talent. I think Eliot is an excellent critic in many ways, and his felicity for phrasing does pass into common use here. Let me get rid of this so you don't get blinded by this. But this is taken from the work in which he first published it, The Egoist, September 1919, Tradition and the Individual Talent. I'll just read a few extracts from it and then we'll comment. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition. 1919, the end of the First World War. Same time that Oswald Spengler is writing The Decline and Fall of the West, something like that. Is that the? And so there's a sense of tradition, the nation state having destroyed itself. And I cannot emphasize too much, this is one of the main contexts of contemporary lit theory. I don't think you can separate it and make it just a literary development. It is a mood that comes as a result of the great nation states of Europe fighting in a war that they thought was going to be concluded within months. They thought it was going to be a quick war, and it's all over. And instead it ends up being a 4-year trench battle over very little ground, mud, and millions die. And it's so devastating to the sensibilities of progress. Titanic sinks, the First World War, it kills a generation of men. Women will grow up with no husbands. Families will grow up with no sons. And it was fought, the First World War, if you look at the documents at the time, it's often fought in the name of religion as well on both sides. And the result of that is a sort of mood that sets in over Europe that does not go away. There is a sense of despair that sets in, and a sense of the tradition not being very useful anymore. The forms are broken. The wineskins are no longer, the old wineskins will no longer hold the wine we want, and the modernist movement begins and tries to hold on to something of the tradition, but it's a pale shadow of the former notion of tradition. So they're trying to justify tradition in the truest sense, that which of the past was written but continues to speak to us today, because that's the only tradition that actually counts, is how tradition continues to speak into the contemporary. And so they're trying to say through their approach to writing that the tradition still does have a voice that we need to listen to, but we're not going to hold on to the form too strongly because the forms are all broken. So he says this: in English writing we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition. At most, we employ the adjective in saying that the poetry of so-and-so is traditional, or even too traditional. Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. If otherwise, it is vaguely approbative, vaguely approved, with the implication, as to the work approved, of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. It's interesting to the antiquarian, people who like old things, like the smell of old books or something, or just like to hang around in the look of old buildings. You can hardly make the word agreeable to English ears without this comfortable reference to the reassuring science of archaeology. So it has to almost have that reference to old buildings and the love of old buildings, old things that have stood the test of time. comfort. Certainly the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. Every nation, remember this is 1919, time when pop cultural reference, Lord Grantham and what's that series? Downton Abbey. That's the time, like the beginning of that, right then. It's quite well done in certain ways. In other ways, it's obviously anachronistic, but I don't need that. But it tries to set that stage here. And there is, the tradition is seen to be no longer relevant. It doesn't work anymore. The old ways, the old habits, the old virtues, the old aristocracy are tottering. They're on their way out. They have to adapt or die. That's Downton Abbey. All right, there's that. So they even have light, the electricity being invented, brought in, and that, and the context, the Titanic sinks, and so forth. So they're making these references to technological or historical events that symbolize the decline of the aristocracy and its ways. So that tradition is dead. It needs to move on. And I think there's a wistfulness about Downton Abbey that laments the loss of that, while at the same time being pretty unflinching in its criticism of them as well. Anyway, certainly the word tradition is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. Every nation, every race has not only its own creative, but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. We know, or think we know, from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in the French language, the critical method or habit of the French. We only conclude, we are such unconscious people, that the French are more critical than we, says the American TS Eliot, who's been transplanted to Britain, speaking as a Brit. And sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the fact that as if the French were the less spontaneous. Perhaps they are. But we might remind ourselves that criticism, and here's one of his famous phrases, criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our minds in their work of criticism. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist, when we praise a poet, upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. In these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual. We pretend. What is the peculiar essence of the man? So we see a distillation of the man in the text and say this is what makes him himself. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his intimate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas, if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. And I do not intend the impressionable period of adolescence, but the period of full maturity. So he's making a cultural commentary as much as anything else here. And note, I after class last time we talked a little bit the Dead Poet Society. Now, isn't that interesting, the Dead Poet Society as well? The dead poets assert their immortality most vigorously? Yes, but they assert it in Dead Poet Society in a romanticized form where the kids are encouraged to rip up the written text and stand on the table to the Wilhelm Tell's overture and the paean to the French Revolution, right? And be anti-traditional. That's the tradition being promoted there. Anyway, yet if the only form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us and a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition should positively be discouraged. It's stale, it's tedious, it's repetitive, it's pointless, it's irrelevant. We've seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition. Novelty is better than repetition. Now, there's a very interesting take. Aristotle defines the act of literature as mimesis, which is a sort of a repetition or imitation at any rate. There is a difference between repetition and imitation. Imitation does not involve repetition. So he's not necessarily deviating from Aristotle here. He's talking about repetition, not imitation. Imitation is you can be bringing your own interpretation to it and still imitating, right? Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited. And if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year, the year in which Mr. Keats died. And the historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write, not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer and within it, the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This historical sense, which I've just said is not historical but traditional, and I think that distinction is helpful. I wish he'd said that here. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, that's traditional, and of the timeless of the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time that makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his contemporaneity. No poet, no artist of any sort, of any art, has his complete meaning alone. Now, this is helpful. I said in the 18th century, the theory of language is that language began in grunts and cries. It then became articulated grunts and cries. The articulated sounds, which we call words, they're pointing very directly, it's this, not that. Yeah, those articulated sounds, words, were agreed upon, yes, that's the word for that, and then they start, by convention, that becomes, well, the language only works when there is agreement on what words mean. Definitions have to be true. I just dispute the theory of how language evolves, but I don't dispute that the terms we have to agree that this word means this word, and that means it can't mean that word. It has to exclude other things, and certainly it has to exclude the opposite. A male cannot be a female. A black, something that's black can't be white, or it's no longer black. Right? Otherwise, the word is meaningless. If it can be whatever you want it to mean, then it isn't a common inheritance anymore. Something has been lost there in the very use of the term. So so he relates to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. Now, does Bloom even go this far as a principle of aesthetic, that we see ourselves in comparison? He doesn't even. It's an extraordinary thing. And it's a romantic thing. Romantic in the sense that he prizes above all things originality. And that means utter novelty, which is a very romantic, critical ideal. Very much so. So I put Bloom before this on purpose. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. Now there's an interesting thing. It's not just that we are affected by what became before, but that we read Homer as Christians. We read Homer as post-Christians, if you will. But we don't read Homer the way Homer's contemporaries would have read Homer. We read him, there's a difference there in reading. We can't, now we may want to recover the way Homer's contemporaries might have understood him in order to appreciate the difference between him and us even better. that historicizing, contextualizing. But we have to, at the end of the day, come to, if we're going to be critics, to an evaluation of what's the right reading here. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, says Eliot, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new work of art amongst themselves. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so, the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And this is conformity between the old and the new. Whoever has approved this idea of order of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past would be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. And now these are all very interesting comments. So the past is a guide to the present. So the postulate that I referred to last time of amnesia is they're not just blind guides. These are people who mean you harm. Trust me, follow my teaching, forget what anybody else has said, ignore it. I'm going to silence their voices. It is a posture of hatred towards the tradition in any sense, and it is a hermeneutic at odds with the tradition for that matter, because it regards the past as something that we are divorced from, as if we were orphans. And I've mentioned to you in my courses repeatedly that the ideal of the orphan as a literary development emerges in the 19th century and carries on to this present day. It's a non-traditional tradition. It's a new tradition. And its consequences are wholly destructive. So one of the reasons that the First World War and the Second World War happen is that the nation states do not see a commonality between themselves and are willing to fight over what they regard as the stake of humanity, the future of humanity, and they've defined that in terms of the nation state. The German people have to fight to the death because at stake is their very existence. We will be subsumed into the masses of those who are evolving less quickly than we, and if we don't kill them off, they're going to bring us down and everyone's going to perish. There's that perverse sense, and you can read it in the rhetoric of the Nazi era, that's rooted in a Darwinist notion of the survival of the fittest. And if we don't survive and defeat the others, then we're not the fittest, and then we're going to come crashing down into ruins. And so there's a sense that the Jew is not a human. In fact, they're a virus that needs to be eradicated. We got to cut that out in order to be healthy and whole and survive into the future. There's that dynamic. It's a very non-traditional way of looking at it. In fact, it's a very diseased mindset. But it arises out of a non-traditional view of the nation. The nations are now divorced from one another, and they don't have a commonality in Adam and Eve. Right? They're just different people groups, identity groups, arising and then fighting. That's the First World War, and it's happening throughout Europe. The Germans think that they're the best, so do the English, so do the French. The Americans will think that they are, and the reason that they are is because they're not going to do it by blood, they're going to do it by creed. The Americans are best because they don't have that sort of racial identity, they have a creedal identity. That only holds valid if the creed that they hold is true. What they believe. A belief in belief that's not a true belief is no improvement. This is why I think the Christian faith is so important, because there's a commonality there in that creed. You see your fellow man, even your enemy, as your brother. You're to love him. So what Eliot does here is takes the classic theoretical expression of the modernist idea of tradition, that the new work takes its meaning from the pre-existence of tradition and at the same time alters the tradition. And I happen to think that this is correct. I think that is actually what tradition does. That's how I've encouraged students here at Tyndall to read at any rate, is to see echoes of the one and the other. And I think even the Bible works this way. What happens in Genesis 1 to 3 is echoed throughout later works. There's prophecy going on there. The prophecy is fulfilled. So you have to read the incarnation, the Annunciation, in the light of Genesis 3. Your seed will crush the serpent's head. He will bruise your heel. You have to read the later text in the light of the earlier text. But when Christ comes, that changes how you read that, because now that time of fulfillment is at hand. So it's actually a biblical way of reading all of history. And that, I think, is actually what is really at stake in the attack on the tradition. They don't like the sense that Christ has incarnated and changed all of human history, even though our calendars clearly reflect that. Even if we don't want to talk about BC and AD and want to talk about the common era, what is common about the common era? It's the same date, right? We just put it, we don't want to refer to the Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. We can't do that. We'll call it the common era. Okay, but it's still the timeline. So that where are you going to put it then? I'm just waiting for the day when they realize that and start putting the timing of everything. The year 0 to some other date. Well, that's what we read about in 1984. You even have to change the significance of time. It's the date of Big Brother, right? That's going to be year 0. Yes.
That's with the French Revolution.
Absolutely.
Right.
The French Revolution realized they had to do that to the point where they had to get rid of the significance of the 7-day week. They tried to make it metric. We're going to have a 10-day week. A 10-day week, yes, because it's in conformity with the whole metric system. It's rational, it's orderly, and the result of it was absolute chaos. It was abandoned within 10 years. Said enough of this. It might work with the measurements, might work with Celsius, freezes at 100, freezes at 0, boils at 100. That I like that. That seems to be very orderly. But it doesn't fit with the measurements of human life at all. It's an abstract idea of measurement all over the place. I actually support the imperial system, which makes me very old-fashioned. But there's something that is the measures and weights there are fitting with the human experience. So a foot is the length of your foot. That's what a foot is. Yep, it's a bodily measurement. And so on. Let me not get off on that topic. But so the pre-existing order determines the significance of the current work, and at the same time the old order is influenced in some way, transformed by the new thing. And the argument is designed to justify modernist formal innovation to some degree by saying it's traditional. And this is why I'm not buying it myself. I don't think the modernist movement is nearly as traditional as it would like it to be, but such is the despair amongst the intellectuals in the early 20th century that this is all they can hold on to. As I say, there's another modernist movement, traditional, which I think the Inklings launch, which should be continued in many ways. And the classical school movement, or the great books movement of Chicago, is another move in that direction. We're not going to just use the modernism of Eliot and that despair of his time period as the only way we can engage with tradition. We're going to recover the tradition as much as we possibly can by reading that whole genre of works, that whole body of works. Anyway, it is a bit of a tactical coup from the perspective of literature. And Eliot's later work, The Metaphysical Poets, so he wrote this in 1921, argues that the metaphysical poets, by which he means Donne and Herbert Marvell, belong in the mainstream of tradition. And they're not much regarded at this point, very interestingly. That Donne and Herbert and Marvell, not really, they're pushed aside a little bit in English letters. It's largely because of Eliot's efforts that we now read them and see them as part of the tradition. But the reason he does this is he says that there are mainstreams of tradition, the metaphysical poets, that we have ignored. But why have we ignored them? Because we've gone down into another stream. And what is that stream? It's Romanticism. And that is, he would call it, it's a subcurrent which we need to get out of and get back into the mainstream. An argument that I actually agree with. So this is the direct current of English poetry comes from the metaphysical poets, he says. And so he adopts a metaphysical technique in his own poetry then, for that matter, which you may like or you may not like, the idea of the patient etherized on the table. That line, it's a metaphysical conceit. And he thinks that metaphysical approaches to poetry fit the modern age with its mechanism and so forth. We're going to use those sorts of literary devices. So, as I say, he doesn't assert that, but he implies it. And I think it's a clear implication. Most of the English poetry of the 19th century does not belong in the direct current of English poetry. It is an excursion that we should get off that. And so the modernist movement sees itself against the Romantics. And I'm against the Romantics in that sense, although I don't like the modernist current either per se. I think it concedes too much. But Eliot's, and I'm just saying this because I'm going to have to wind up here, I won't get further into this, I've given you the gist of it. Eliot's defense of modernist poetry in the name of continuity, that leapfrogs over the 19th century, finds champions in the academy. Very important ones at that. One of them is named F.R. Leavis in Cambridge, a contemporary of Lewis and Tolkien. Another in the United States is Cleanth Brooks, and these are called the New Critics. Now, I used to teach a fair bit on the New Critics, but I've dropped that, not because I don't think they're important, but because later developments required my attention on this course. But the New Critics try and focus on the work of literature, and they try and cut out the acids of historicism or relativism. So they want us to ignore the intentional fallacy, as they call it, or the effective fallacy. These are their terms. This is Brooks's terms. Effective fallacy. What do they mean by that? The intentional fallacy is asking what the author intended by what's in the text. The effective fallacy is, how does the work make me feel? The New Critics argue that we should not consider those extra textual matters as the subject of good and true criticism. We should only look at the text. What is the text saying? And the text then exists, if there is a context, it's less history than it is tradition. But you're going to focus, and that's the New Criticism. It's again a sort of revolt against Romanticism, which is all contextual. It's all the spirit of the age. It's all an expression of the zeitgeist, etc. So they move from these literary judgments to an attack on modern culture as a whole, as a very simple matter. And there are others there. Now, there are those, I am really running short on time here, and I mentioned the New Critics, etc., because when we come back to Terry Eagleton, he'll refer to the New Critics as well. as the backdrop. And by the way the new critics are school us to think is the way that English literature, this is the sort of the foundation for the approach to the discipline as English develops. The new critics dominate the field. From the 40s and 50s and 60s, the new critics approach, we look at the text and not the context, not the historicizing, relativizing work of the Romantics that are always going to say that everything that we read in the text is just an expression of what came before it, and they want to move away from that hermeneutics. That reigns until the 1960s. And even when it's considered to be neutral, there are connotations of orthodoxy. There are connotations of orthodoxy there, and Northrop Frye mentions those. So when you include, you also exclude. And Frye argues that there are non-literary considerations that are brought to bear in there. It's not only literary things, there are theological, which I think is simply true. And so then the question becomes, whose theology? I also think it's unavoidable. There's no neutrality towards text because we are not neutral beings. We are always involved in life around us, and life has meaning and purpose and so forth, and the meaning and purposes that are in our lives are also going to apply to the text. What religious point of view are you going to take when you approach these texts? Frye is correct. Frye, who taught at Victoria College just down the road here at University of Toronto. Blake scholar, sometimes lumped together with the new critics, although I don't think he entirely fits. He goes down his own path. United Church minister, very non-traditionalist in his views theologically, but a great literary critic, and we'll come to him in a few classes as well, looking at his views on form. So the criteria for inclusion, says Frye, always involve extra literary values. And so this creates problems. Some will defend that religious intervention into the realm of literary criticism. Some will welcome it, and then some, like Harold Bloom, will despise it and want out of it. So this is what Harold Bloom shares with his feminist critics, is that they don't want to read it in a Christian way. They want to airbrush the Christianity out of the tradition. It's a non-traditional approach to the tradition. You can't really do that per se, at least traditionally. On the other hand, what he wants to do, and this will differentiate himself from his critics, they want to make everything a matter of sociology or of cultural studies. In other words, they're going to relativize it and minimize or even argue the insignificance of the traditional canon of literature. And he's going to say, no, the canon is of enduring significance because it exalts the aesthetic, which is unfortunately the end effect of the new critics reading divorced of any religious affiliations. If you just talk about the text and don't talk about religion, purpose, meaning, life, human nature, metaphysics, if you ignore all those things, then you're left pretty much with aesthetics, and that's it, divorced of all those things. And then it cannot stand, the tradition cannot be defended in any persuasive fashion. And it falls. So the last defense of the tradition made by Harold Bloom was non-traditional, and it utterly failed. I mean, he's aware of it even when he writes it. He says, we've already lost the fight. The man who's 40 years at Yale University, we've lost this fight, it's over. And he gives his library to a little Catholic liberal arts college and let them carry on. They're the only ones who seem to have any regard for the tradition. But isn't it interesting that it's the religious groups that value the tradition, even though it's not about the Christian faith per se. But then the development of the tradition does engage with that, because the Christian faith, which adheres to truth, believes that all truth is God's truth, and there's an actual intellectual engagement that goes on in that context, which I try and do here as well. Anyway, I think I should probably leave it off at that, because we have run out of time. Comment, or maybe I should leave you there. Do you have any questions or comments here? Next time we're going to look at Terry Eagleton's setting of the stage for the rise of English literature. But I've given you a fair bit of meat to chew on there. Anyway, okay.